I realized something irreversible had already begun the night she looked at me with a kind of careful hope and said, almost apologetically, I don't want you to pretend, you'd have to really try to understand what it's like. At the time, I thought she was talking about clothes. That was my first mistake, and maybe my most forgivable one. We had been together a little over 2 years, long enough that silence had developed its own vocabulary between us. We were good at reading the pauses, when one of us was tired, when something was bothering her mother again, when I was avoiding a decision by being overly agreeable. That night, the pause felt different. It sat between us like a question that had already been answered somewhere else. She told me slowly, choosing words as if they might bruise. She had always imagined herself with another woman, she said, not instead of me, not because something was missing, but because there was a way of being seen by a woman that felt fuller to her. She was careful to say this wasn't about sex, and I believed her, not because I was especially enlightened but because I knew her tells, and this wasn't one of them. This was the voice she used when she was afraid of being unfair. Then she said it, the sentence that would replay itself in my head for months, sometimes I imagine you as my girlfriend too. I laughed, reflexively, the way people do when they think they're being invited into a joke they don't quite get. But she didn't laugh back. She waited. There was no pressure in her posture, just openness, and that somehow made it worse. If she had pushed, I could have resisted. Instead, she trusted me with something fragile and let it sit in my hands. I told her I didn't know what that meant. She nodded, as if that were the most reasonable response in the world. She said she didn't know either, not fully. She wasn't asking me to become someone else. She was asking whether I'd be willing to explore what it might feel like to step out of the role I'd been given so effortlessly by everyone else. That word, role, followed me long after she fell asleep. I had always been good at performing masculinity in the way that earns quiet approval. Not aggressively, not loudly, but competently. I knew how to be steady, how to be useful, how to keep my voice even. I had absorbed those skills so early that they felt like instincts rather than lessons. No one had ever questioned them, least of all me. But lying awake beside her, I wondered for the first time whether something could feel natural simply because it had never been tested. We agreed, eventually, on something modest. No declarations, no labels, no sudden public experiments. Just time. Curiosity without commitment. Honesty without theatrics. If either of us felt uncomfortable, we'd stop. If it felt like play acting, we'd stop. If it felt like a lie, especially, we'd stop. The first changes were so small they could have passed as accidents. She suggested I let my hair grow a little longer, framing it not as a transformation but as an aesthetic curiosity. I had worn it short for most of my life because that was what I'd been told suited me, and because it required no decisions. Growing it out introduced daily choices I hadn't anticipated, how to part it, whether to tame it, whether to let it do what it wanted. I became aware of my reflection in passing windows in a way that felt unfamiliar, not critical, exactly, but attentive. Then there were the conversations. She asked me how I felt moving through the world as a man. Not whether I liked it, but whether I noticed it. I realized I didn't, not consciously. I moved with an assumption of neutrality, of being unremarkable. She pointed out moments I'd never clocked before, how waiters addressed me versus her, how strangers gave me more physical space, how my discomfort was often interpreted as authority rather than vulnerability. Imagine, she said once, if every one of those things changed at once. I resisted then, not outwardly but inside. There was a defensive tightening, a sense that this line of thinking was a critique, an accusation. I wanted to tell her I hadn't asked for those advantages, that I wasn't responsible for them. But something in her expression, curious, not condemning, made me pause. She wasn't assigning guilt. She was inviting awareness. When she first asked if I wanted to try on something of hers, the moment felt ceremonial despite its ordinariness. It was a sweater, soft and slightly oversized on her, hanging looser on me. There was nothing provocative about it. I remember being surprised by that, by how little it resembled the caricatures I'd absorbed from jokes and internet detritus. It was just clothing. And yet, standing there, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because I felt feminine, exactly, but because I felt unguarded. The sweater didn't demand anything of me, no toughness, no restraint. It simply existed, and in wearing it, I was allowed to exist differently too. She didn't comment, didn't guide, didn't correct. She watched me the way you watch someone learning a new language, patiently, with respect for the effort involved. After that, it became harder to pretend this was about her fantasy alone. I began noticing the quiet relief I felt in these moments, the way my shoulders dropped when I wasn't performing competence. I noticed how carefully I had been managing myself for years, editing gestures, filtering emotions, minimizing softness because I hadn't known where else to put it. This wasn't about wanting to be a woman, not in any simple or declarative sense. It was about realizing how narrow my version of myself had been. That realization scared me more than any outfit ever could. I thought about my family, about the language they used to praise me, solid, dependable, a good man. I wondered whether those words had room to stretch or whether they would snap if pulled too far from their original shape. I thought about my friends, about the jokes we made that relied on a shared understanding of what was off-limits to sincerity. I thought about the way the world categorizes first and asks questions later. Most of all, I thought about honesty. About what it would mean to continue without examining this, to quietly file it away as something indulged and abandoned. I didn't want this to become a secret I carried like a moral debt. If I was going to explore, I needed to do it with integrity, not as a performance for her or a rebellion against anyone else. One night, weeks in, she asked me how I saw myself when I imagined her calling me her girlfriend. I searched for an answer that felt clever or reassuring and found none. Instead, I told her the truth, that the word unsettled me not because it felt wrong, but because it felt undefined. It didn't erase who I was, but it didn't reinforce it either. It asked me to sit in uncertainty, and I wasn't practiced at that. She smiled then, not triumphantly, not expectantly, but warmly. "That's all I was hoping for," she said. "That you'd think about it." That was when I understood this wasn't a detour from my life. It was a widening of it, and widenings come with consequences. They require responsibility. They ask you to carry what you learn forward, even if you decide not to continue. I didn't know yet how far this would go, or what it would cost, or what it would give back. I only knew that something essential had shifted, not my body, not my name, but my attention. And once attention changes, you can't return to ignorance without choosing it. That choice, I was beginning to see, would matter. I didn't notice the second phase beginning so much as I noticed that the first one had ended, that the careful novelty of trying something new had quietly given way to habit. What unsettled me wasn't that the experiments continued, but that they no longer felt like experiments at all. There was a morning when I reached for one of her cardigans without thinking. It wasn't dramatic. I was cold, running late, and it was closer than my jacket. I only realized what I'd done when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, half-dressed, hair still damp, wearing something that wasn't mine by ownership but had begun to feel mine by familiarity. The moment didn't come with a rush or a shock. It came with recognition, the kind that settles in your chest slowly, like a truth you've been circling for years without naming. I stood there longer than necessary, studying not the cardigan but my face. I was looking for something, evidence of transformation, maybe, or betrayal. Instead, I saw someone slightly more awake than usual. Someone paying attention. That attentiveness followed me into the world. I began noticing how often I had been invisible to myself. How many of my days were spent on autopilot, performing competence so smoothly that I barely registered my own presence. There was a strange irony in it. By stepping into something that made me feel socially conspicuous, even privately, I became more internally grounded. I felt less like a collection of expectations and more like a person having experiences. She noticed the change before I articulated it. She always did. "You're quieter," she said one evening as we cooked together. Not accusatory. Observant. "I think I'm listening more," I replied, surprised to find it was true. That was when the conversations deepened, shifting from curiosity to consequence. We talked about what it meant for her to imagine me as her girlfriend, not as a replacement for herself, not as a novelty, but as a relational dynamic. She described wanting softness without fragility, intimacy without hierarchy. She talked about how exhausting it could be to always be the one explaining herself to the world, and how the idea of sharing that space, even partially, felt like relief. I asked her whether she worried I might lose something in the process. She thought about it for a long time. "I worry you might lose protection," she said finally. "The kind you didn't know you had." That landed harder than I expected. Because she was right. There were doors that opened for me without effort, assumptions that worked in my favor before I spoke. I had moved through the world buffered by a category that absorbed impact. To step even slightly outside of it wasn't just an internal shift, it was a social negotiation. And I had the privilege of choosing when to step back in. That realization forced a kind of moral reckoning. I didn't want to treat this as tourism, visiting vulnerability without bearing its weight. If I was going to explore this part of myself, I needed to do so with humility, aware of the difference between experimentation and lived reality. I needed to listen more than I spoke, learn more than I claimed. So I did something that surprised both of us. I started asking other people questions. Carefully, respectfully, without centering myself. I read essays and memoirs not looking for validation, but for understanding. I paid attention to the language people used to describe their inner lives, the way joy and fear often coexisted rather than canceling each other out. What struck me most was how often people talked about exhaustion, not just from hostility, but from being misunderstood, from constantly translating themselves. I began to recognize echoes of that exhaustion in her, in moments I'd previously misread as moodiness or distance. Awareness reshaped memory. Past interactions rearranged themselves under new light. At home, the changes continued, still subtle but cumulative. She taught me things not as lessons but as shared discoveries, how certain fabrics affected posture, how tone of voice could shift perception, how being seen differently changed the way you occupied space. These weren't instructions on how to be anything. They were invitations to notice. And I did notice. I noticed how often I had taken up space without meaning to. How rarely I'd been interrupted. How seldom my emotions had been dismissed as overreactions. Wearing different clothes didn't magically reverse those patterns, but it disrupted them enough to make me conscious of their existence. Consciousness, I was learning, is the beginning of responsibility. There were moments of discomfort, too, important ones. Times when I caught myself enjoying the novelty of being perceived as different, and had to interrogate that enjoyment. Was I romanticizing struggle? Was I mistaking attention for insight? Each time, the questions mattered more than the answers. They kept me honest. One afternoon, while we were out walking, she slipped her hand into mine with a gentleness that felt newly intentional. I realized then that she wasn't guiding me toward an identity, she was meeting me in a shared vulnerability. The fantasy she'd named at the beginning had never been about me becoming someone else. It had been about us renegotiating the terms of closeness. That realization didn't resolve my uncertainty, it deepened it. But it also grounded me. I wasn't losing myself. I was encountering myself under different conditions. Later that night, lying awake again, I thought about how easy it would be to stop. To say we'd learned enough, that the experiment had served its purpose. And maybe that would have been fine. But I also knew that stopping now would mean stopping not out of clarity, but out of fear of what continued attention might require of me. Growth, I was discovering, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with certainty. It feels like standing at the edge of something unfinished, knowing that stepping back would be simpler, but stepping forward would be truer. I didn't yet know what a forward meant. I only knew I wasn't done listening. The first time someone else noticed, really noticed, was the moment I understood that whatever this was had crossed from private reflection into shared reality. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no raised eyebrows. Just a pause. We were at a small gathering, friends of hers, mostly, people I knew well enough to be comfortable, but not well enough to be unfiltered. I'd chosen my clothes carefully that night, not to conceal, but not to announce. The choices I was making had become quieter, more intentional. I no longer wanted the rush of reaction, positive or negative. I wanted to know how it felt to exist this way without commentary. At some point during the evening, one of her friends looked at me for a beat longer than usual. Not assessing, not judging, recognizing. Her eyes softened, and she smiled in a way that felt less like politeness and more like acknowledgement. Later, when we were alone, my girlfriend asked me how it felt. "I don't know yet," I said. And that was true. What I felt wasn't fear, exactly. It was exposure layered with relief. The kind that comes when something you've been carrying quietly is no longer invisible. That night marked a shift. Not because I decided anything, but because the world had begun to respond. And once the world responds, reflection becomes responsibility. I started paying attention to how my presence changed in shared spaces. How conversations bent differently around me. How I hesitated more before speaking, not out of insecurity but out of awareness. I noticed when people made assumptions, some generous, some limiting, and how quickly those assumptions replaced the neutral default I'd once taken for granted. This wasn't punishment. It was information. There were moments when I missed the ease of my old invisibility, the way masculinity had functioned like a universal pass. I hadn't realized how much energy it saved me until I began spending that energy consciously. Choosing how to sit. Modulating my voice. Reading a room with greater care. These weren't inherently feminine acts, I knew that intellectually, but they were behaviors I'd never been expected to master before. I felt both humbled and sharpened by the effort. At home, we talked more openly about boundaries. What this meant for us. What it didn't. She was careful not to romanticize my discomfort, and I was careful not to center myself in her long-standing experiences. We held each other accountable gently, correcting without accusation. One night, I asked her something I'd been circling for weeks. "Do you ever worry," I said, "that this will change how you see me?" She didn't answer right away. She rarely did with questions that mattered. "It already has," she said eventually. "But not in the way you think." She explained that seeing me grapple with uncertainty, without defensiveness, without retreat, had deepened her trust. That masculinity, as she'd experienced it, often came with an unspoken refusal to question itself. Watching me do exactly that felt intimate in a way she hadn't expected. That both comforted and unsettled me. I didn't want to earn praise for something that felt like basic honesty. But I understood what she meant. Vulnerability changes the shape of relationships. It redistributes emotional labor. I began thinking about my past through this new lens. About moments when I'd dismissed others' discomfort because it didn't resemble my own. About jokes I hadn't challenged because they didn't target me. About the ease with which I'd mistaken neutrality for fairness. This wasn't about guilt. Guilt would have been simpler. This was about accountability, the quiet, ongoing kind that doesn't resolve into a single apology or declaration. It asked for consistency. I tried to practice that consistency in small ways. Speaking up when something felt off. Listening without rushing to reassure. Allowing myself to feel uncertain without immediately reaching for control. These were skills I'd never been taught, but once learned, they felt necessary. There was grief in that realization too. Grief for the version of myself who hadn't known how much he was missing. Grief for the years spent equating emotional restraint with maturity. I didn't resent that version of myself, I understood him, but I no longer wanted to live there. The question of identity hovered, unspoken but present. Friends asked careful questions. Family members noticed changes they couldn't quite name. I answered honestly without oversharing, naming experience rather than label. I wasn't ready to define myself by something still in motion. And motion was exactly what this felt like, not a leap, but a gradual reorientation. Like learning you've been walking slightly off-center your entire life and slowly adjusting your balance. There were days when I felt strong in this new awareness, grounded and calm. There were days when I felt fragile, longing for the simplicity of being unexamined. I learned not to treat either feeling as a verdict. They were weather, not destination. One evening, standing beside her in the mirror, I caught sight of us together and felt something unexpected, continuity. Not contradiction, not performance. Just two people evolving side by side, allowing the relationship to grow around us rather than confining ourselves to its original shape. That was when I understood something essential. This wasn't about becoming her girlfriend. It was about becoming someone capable of meeting her, and myself, without hiding behind roles that no longer fit. I didn't know where that path would lead. But I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was walking it deliberately now. The longest stretch of change didn't announce itself with milestones. There was no single day I could point to and say, this is when it became real. Instead, it unfolded the way seasons do when you're not watching the calendar, slowly enough that you doubt anything is happening, until one morning you realize the air feels different in your lungs. I started keeping small mental notes, not as evidence, but as orientation. How I felt walking into a room. How I felt when I spoke and when I stayed quiet. How my body responded to being looked at, not with hostility, but with curiosity. None of these sensations were entirely new, but their frequency was. They began to stack, one on top of another, until they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. The most difficult part was not fear of judgment. It was responsibility. Because once you know something about yourself, once you've felt what it's like to move even slightly outside the boundaries you were handed, you're accountable for what you do with that knowledge. You can't unknow it. You can't pretend neutrality. You can choose silence, but silence becomes a choice rather than an accident. I felt that weight most strongly around people who loved me. My family noticed before they understood. A comment here, a pause there. My mother asked if I was tired. My father asked if work was stressful. These were the languages they had for concern. I didn't correct them, not because I was hiding, but because I didn't yet have a translation that felt honest without being overwhelming. I was learning, still, and I didn't want to teach from half-formed certainty. That restraint was new for me. I'd always believed clarity was a moral virtue, that you owed people explanations, resolutions, conclusions. Sitting in ambiguity felt like withholding, like cowardice. But I began to understand that premature explanations can be a form of dishonesty too. Naming something before you understand it doesn't make it true, it just makes it louder. At the same time, I couldn't retreat fully into privacy. That would have been easier, but it would have turned this inward exploration into something secretive, even shame-adjacent. I didn't want secrecy. I wanted discernment. So I practiced saying things like, I'm learning something about myself, and letting that be enough. Some people accepted that. Some didn't know what to do with it. Their discomfort mirrored my own, and in that mirroring, I found unexpected compassion. We were all navigating scripts we hadn't written, trying to improvise without embarrassing ourselves. Public spaces became classrooms. Not in the dramatic sense, no confrontations, no speeches, but in the accumulation of micro-interactions. A cashier who hesitated before choosing an honorific. A stranger who smiled, then looked away more quickly than usual. A conversation where I was interrupted for the first time in years, and felt a flash of irritation followed by recognition. So this is what it feels like, I thought. Not oppression. Not danger. Just erosion. A small wearing down of certainty. I didn't romanticize it. If anything, it sobered me. It made me acutely aware of how little I had previously noticed, how much I'd taken ease for granted. And it forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth: empathy that costs nothing is not empathy. It's alignment. Real empathy requires friction. At home, the emotional labor shifted again. She was careful, always, to check in with me, not because she doubted my agency, but because she respected it. And I learned to do the same, asking questions not as reassurance seeking but as calibration. We talked about how this exploration affected attraction, partnership, future imagining. Not with panic, but with seriousness. There were nights when she admitted fear too. Fear that I might discover something about myself that would change the shape of our relationship irrevocably. Fear that she was opening a door she couldn't close. We didn't try to soothe those fears away. We let them exist between us, named but not amplified. That mutual honesty deepened something fundamental. For the first time, I understood intimacy not as closeness, but as co-presence in uncertainty. Staying when answers don't arrive on schedule. Choosing care over control. My internal dialogue changed as well. The voice that once demanded coherence softened. Instead of asking, "What are you?" it began asking, "What are you learning?" That shift felt small, but it was seismic. Identity stopped being a verdict and became a process. I noticed how often people treat self-understanding as a destination, as if once you arrive you're supposed to stop moving. But movement, I was learning, is the point. The moment you freeze yourself for the comfort of others, or for your own fear, you begin to shrink. There were setbacks. Days when I felt ridiculous, overthinking everything. Days when I missed the blunt simplicity of being assumed. Days when I wondered if this was all an elaborate way of avoiding some other reckoning. I took those doubts seriously. I examined them without letting them drive. What grounded me was integrity. I wasn't chasing an aesthetic. I wasn't seeking validation. I wasn't rejecting my past. I was responding honestly to my present experience, adjusting my understanding as new information arrived. That felt ethical. That felt adult. One evening, after a long walk, she asked me something that caught me off guard. "If this never goes any further," she said, "would it still have mattered?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the heightened awareness, the redistributed empathy, the way my inner life had expanded. I thought about the conversations I could no longer unhear, the assumptions I could no longer make. "Yes," I said finally. "It already does." Because the truth was, I could not return to who I'd been, not fully. Even if I chose a more conventional outward life, I would be choosing it consciously now, with knowledge of its trade-offs. That alone changed everything. This wasn't about transformation as spectacle. It was about maturation. About learning that the self is not a fixed object to be defended, but a relationship to be tended, with care, with honesty, with courage. And courage, I was realizing, isn't loud. It's quiet consistency. It's staying present when it would be easier to simplify. As I lay awake that night, I felt something settle, not certainty, but commitment. Commitment to continue paying attention. Commitment to act with empathy informed by experience rather than theory. Commitment to myself, not as an identity, but as a living, changing person. Whatever came next, I knew this much: I was no longer afraid of becoming someone I didn't yet fully understand. If the earlier months had been about attention, this phase was about endurance, the quiet, unglamorous work of living inside what I'd learned without constantly narrating it to myself. Awareness, once new, loses its novelty. What remains is practice. And practice is where ideals are tested. The first real strain came not from strangers, but from proximity. A close friend, someone who had known me long enough to feel entitled to familiarity, made an offhand remark one night. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even especially pointed. It was the kind of joke that passes unnoticed most of the time, cushioned by history. I felt it land differently now, not like an attack, but like a misalignment. Something inside me flinched. For a moment, I considered letting it go. That would have been the easiest path, the one I'd walked most of my life. But ease had stopped feeling neutral. It felt like avoidance. So I said something. Not a lecture. Not a correction delivered from moral height. Just a sentence that doesn't really sit right with me anymore. The room went quiet, not hostile, just uncertain. He looked surprised, then defensive, then thoughtful. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. Later, he asked me about it, genuinely. I explained as best I could, focusing on experience rather than ideology. He listened. Not perfectly. But sincerely. That interaction stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. This was what accountability looked like in real time, not declarations, but moments where you choose alignment over comfort and accept whatever follows. What followed, more often than not, was complexity. Some people leaned in. Others leaned away. A few did both at different times. I learned not to treat these reactions as verdicts on my worth or my direction. They were responses to change, and change unsettles even those who care about you. My girlfriend and I navigated this terrain together, though not always in sync. There were days when I felt resilient and she felt weary, and days when the roles reversed. We learned to say, "I don't have the energy for this conversation today," without letting it become distance. We learned that support doesn't always look like agreement, it looks like patience. One night, she admitted something that reframed much of what we'd been living. "I think," she said slowly, "that what I wanted wasn't for you to be my girlfriend. It was for you to understand what it costs me to be myself." That honesty landed with a mixture of relief and gravity. Relief, because it clarified something I'd sensed but hadn't named. Gravity, because understanding cost implies responsibility. If I truly understood, then indifference was no longer an option. Understanding, I discovered, isn't passive. It demands response. I began noticing how often I'd once deferred emotional labor to her without realizing it. How frequently I'd asked for explanations instead of doing my own work. Awareness made those habits visible, and visibility made them uncomfortable. I resisted the urge to drown that discomfort in self-criticism. Shame, I was learning, is not the same as growth. Growth looks like adjustment. So I adjusted. I caught myself before defaulting to old patterns. I did my own research. I intervened when conversations turned careless. I took responsibility for my learning curve instead of treating it like a shared burden. None of this was heroic. It was simply fair. At the same time, I had to guard against overcorrection. Against turning myself into a performance of sensitivity. Authenticity, I realized, isn't about constant vigilance, it's about consistency. You don't need to announce your values if your behavior carries them. There were moments of unexpected tenderness, too. Times when strangers showed quiet kindness. A barista who complimented my nails without irony. A woman on the bus who struck up a conversation and spoke to me without the guardedness I'd grown accustomed to before. These moments didn't erase the harder ones, but they complicated the narrative. The world wasn't uniformly cruel or kind. It was responsive. And so was I. I started thinking less about who I was becoming and more about how I was relating, to myself, to others, to uncertainty. Identity felt less like a noun and more like a verb. Something you do, not something you own. That shift mattered when fear resurfaced, as it inevitably did. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of future choices I hadn't yet made. Fear that this openness might cost me belonging in ways I couldn't predict. I didn't try to eliminate that fear. I learned to contextualize it. Fear, I realized, isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's just a signal that you're no longer numb. Toward the end of this stretch, something subtle but decisive happened. I stopped framing my experience as borrowed. I wasn't trying on empathy anymore. I was inhabiting it. The insights I'd gained didn't feel external, they felt integrated. Not because I'd mastered anything, but because I'd stopped treating understanding as temporary. One evening, standing alone in the quiet of our apartment, I caught my reflection again, not searching this time, not evaluating. Just noticing. There was no rush of revelation. Only a calm recognition that I was more present in my own life than I had ever been. That presence felt like responsibility, yes, but also like freedom. Freedom not from constraint, but from unconsciousness. And that, I understood, was the real transformation. By the time I realized I was no longer waiting for clarity, I had already learned to live without it. That might sound like resignation, but it wasn't. It was steadier than that. It felt like the moment you stop checking your reflection in a dark window and start watching where you're walking instead. The self doesn't disappear when you stop interrogating it, it integrates. What changed most in this final stretch wasn't how I dressed, or how I was perceived, or even how often I thought about gender. What changed was my relationship to authorship. I stopped asking who I was allowed to be and started asking what kind of person I was willing to be accountable for becoming. That question rearranged everything. There was a quiet afternoon, unremarkable on the surface, that crystallized the shift. I was alone in a public space, waiting, doing nothing of consequence. No one I knew was watching. No narrative depended on my choices. And yet, I felt distinctly present. Grounded. Not braced. Not performing. Just there. It struck me then how much of my earlier life had been lived in anticipation of evaluation. Even confidence, I realized, can be a performance if it's contingent on approval. What I felt now was different. It wasn't pride. It was alignment. Alignment doesn't announce itself. It's felt in the absence of friction. I thought about my girlfriend, about how this journey had begun with her vulnerability, not her demand. She had trusted me with something delicate and allowed me to respond in my own time. In doing so, she had modeled the very ethic I'd spent months learning, that care without coercion is transformative. Our relationship had changed, undeniably. But not in the way people fear when they talk about change. It had become less scripted, more deliberate. We spoke with greater precision. We listened with less defensiveness. We didn't assume permanence as proof of love, we practiced presence instead. One night, long after the urgency had faded, I asked her whether she still thought of me as her girlfriend. She smiled, not nostalgically, not wistfully. Just honestly. I think of you as someone who understands me better than before, she said. And who understands himself better too. That felt right. Not tidy, but right. I reflected then on the title I'd once been tempted to claim or reject. How easily words become containers for anxiety. How often we reach for labels not to express truth, but to stabilize it. I had learned something quieter and more enduring: meaning isn't granted by naming, it's earned through conduct. What mattered wasn't whether I crossed a categorical line. What mattered was that I had crossed an ethical one, away from unconscious inheritance and toward chosen responsibility. I had learned how easily power hides in normalcy. How silence can masquerade as neutrality. How empathy deepens when it's informed by even partial experience. And how integrity is less about consistency with the past than coherence with the present. There were still misunderstandings. There always would be. Some people never fully recalibrated their view of me. Others surprised me with their adaptability. I stopped tracking these outcomes as measures of success or failure. They were data, not destiny. The real measure was internal. I noticed how my patience had expanded. How my listening had sharpened. How my reflex to dominate a conversation had softened into curiosity. These weren't gendered traits. They were human ones I'd previously kept underdeveloped because I hadn't been required to cultivate them. Requirement, I learned, is a powerful teacher. Looking back, I could see that the transformation I'd feared, becoming someone unrecognizable, had never truly been the risk. The greater risk had been remaining someone unexplored. Someone who mistook comfort for truth. This journey hadn't made my life simpler. It had made it more honest. And honesty, while demanding, offers something simplicity never does: dignity. The dignity of knowing that the person you present to the world is not a default setting, but a considered response. In the end, I didn't become her girlfriend. I became someone who could stand beside her without hiding behind a role I'd never chosen. Someone who understood that identity is not a performance you perfect, but a relationship you sustain, with attention, humility, and care. That understanding didn't resolve me into certainty. It resolved me into responsibility. And that, I've come to believe, is what self-acceptance actually looks like.